me, I'd like to learn more about you and listen to, I guess, partly your role at the museum and what that was about in terms of collecting and listening, and have a conversation about that journey and that work. And then your own work as well as a storyteller, which I didn't know about until we spoke about last week. Um,
Well,
so
shall I tell you how I came to be involved in the first place?
yes, please, and we'll take it from there.
Okay. Well, I was brought up in part by my grandmother. She lived with us. My father died when I was a very small child. And my mother had to go out to work. So my grandmother came and sort of looked after us on a daily basis. And I was a strange child and an even stranger adult. And I was always interested in her stories of her own past and what her life had been like. And she wasn't a storyteller. I've actually written an article about her in Folk Music Journal. She wasn't a storyteller particularly, she was a singer. And she was an exceptionally good singer. She had a really beautiful voice. But, now to digress into her story, when she was in her early teens, family had to move from Dunmurry, where they lived at the time, into central Belfast. And her father got a job as the caretaker of the newsletter office. And they lived on what would now be considered a penthouse flat on the top floor of the newsletter. And she and her younger brother was a fantastic singer. Wilfie Green was his name. And they were sitting together, beautiful, beautiful tenor voice. My grandmother was great soprano, and they were sitting together on the steps of the newsletter one day as teenagers, when the owner of the newsletter, Captain Henderson, I think he was, walked past and heard them singing. And he went and spoke to their mother and arranged for them to have formal singing lessons. And my uncle went on, in the middle of the last century, the 1950s and thereabouts, there was big interest in folklore and folk music, and that's the time when the Folk Museum was being established, of course. So Sam Hannibal used to do radio programs at that time. Michael J. Murphy, I mean, hallowed names. Michael J. and Sam Hannibal would be collecting lore together. But when they collected songs in those days, as far as I can make out from reading between the lines and maybe what I was told and some of what I wasn't, the folk songs that they collected, particularly the unaccompanied songs, I think, weren't considered suitable for direct broadcast. They were a bit too raw. And so I think what would happen would be that these would come back, Havelock Nelson or someone like that might set them to music, and then my uncle Wilfie would re-sing them for the radio. But he would sing using his trained concert voice. And I was very aware, when I was a child, I was very aware with my grandmother that she had two different voices. When she was singing to me the songs that she would have learned from her mother, and also more from her older sisters, because she was one of the young, she and my uncle were the youngest in the family. So also from her older sisters, she would sing in a particular kind of way. But when she would be singing in church, she would sing in a different way. So her church voice was her trained voice. But when she would sing to me in the house, she would sing in her natural voice. And I was very interested in this distinction. And I was interested in how come, I suppose this was not a consciously thought out interest at the time, but how come she had these different ways of singing and what the background was to this, and how come she had so few stories. And I began to realise, my background, I'm a minister of religion, I'm a Protestant, and I began to realise that there was actually an issue of cultural politics going on. Because when I said that I wanted to go into folklore and be involved in folklore, my family reacted in a very negative way, partly because, just as with Angry Birds, they thought there was no money in it. I don't know if you find it particularly lucrative, but that's another question. But there was another sort of underpinning to it. I went to school in Dublin and I learned Irish, and there was a lot of negativity at home about that as well, which was a real double bind, because it wasn't that I didn't like learning Irish. It was assumed I started learning Irish. I went to boarding school when I was 9, and because I was in Dublin. All the other children, really, there are very, very few children from the north. All of the others had been learning Irish since the beginning of their national school days. And also, I went in November rather than the beginning of the term, so nobody ever taught me the basics. And I sat sort of mystified by this language for about 4 years. So I
Wow.
found it quite difficult because I didn't, I was sort of having to backfill all the time until I found a teacher, luckily just before I did my intercert, who could explain the basics to me. And I then realised that it wasn't such a drudge after all, and found it was a rather interesting language. But I spent quite a lot of years, between about the age of about 9 and about 13, trying to learn this language that I really hadn't a clue what was going on with, and then going home and and if I said something in Irish, getting either being laughed at or getting a very negative reaction to it. So I began to realise that folklore had become associated, certainly in the minds of my family. I don't want to generalise about this. I think there probably is a general point here, but I am not at the moment attempting to make a general point about the nature of folklore and the people to whom folklore belonged.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, for instance, if you read Rosemary Harris, for instance, she goes into this in a slightly different way. I didn't feel this because quite a lot of the traditions that I did know from my family were shared traditions. Mm-hmm. And so what I began to suspect was, just as my grandmother suppressed her natural singing voice and sang in her concert voice, and even there's a tape in the museum somewhere where she actually says it's worth wasting more tape on another of these songs, so she was very dismissive of all that entire aspect of her life. And it occurred to me that there was a sort of rejection going on of the idea that there was an issue of lost tradition. So for instance, there was a fairy story told in my family when I was a child, a very common one, about the little woman coming to the door of the house. This was supposed to have happened to my great-great-grandmother, and presumably her great-great-grandmother, it had happened to hers. So the little woman comes to the door and says, "Would you mind not throwing your water out of the door like that, because it's coming down my chimney and putting my fire out, and it's really very irritating." Mm-hmm. And this story I used to make ruthless use of when I was collecting, because it's very difficult, or it was very difficult, to ask people about particularly fairy lore, because I very often thought that you wanted to mock them and make a fool of them. So what I did, rather duplicitously, instead of asking, was I would tell them this story, and then I would be one of the appropriate group to hear fairy lore, I suppose. Yeah. I remember talking about this to one of my grandmother's sisters one time, and I said something about this story, and I was making a point of how common it was and how shared it was, not just throughout Ireland, but really throughout many cultures. Mm-hmm. And my aunt, who was a very sophisticated woman, she never married. She was a secretary. She was actually secretary to Robin Kinnahan, who was chairman of the board of the Folk Museum at the time that it was founded. And she was very widely travelled. I mean, she was a very cultivated woman. And she was the last person I expected to have, because again, you always have these prejudices in the back of your mind. Last person I expected to make a comment of this sort. She said, "Oh, well, maybe it's not true after all then." Wow. And I was stunned, because I had destroyed this secret truth that my great aunt had kept about the supernatural, So that was the sort of background that I came from originally. Those sort of ideas, I suppose, that were filtering around in my head. And then but not in any formalized way. And then when I was at university and I was an undergraduate, I started studying drama, and after the first year I decided that I didn't really want to study drama anymore. I wanted to study medieval stuff. So and this was in the University of Ulster at those times, and the courses were terribly free, and you had a few core modules that you had to take, but you had a wide range of choice and other things that you could take. So I was able, without changing course, to shift my direction within my course just by a different selection of models. So I started to study Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse, and I was very interested in the Vikings. And when I was doing my undergraduate dissertation, my supervisor at the time gave me a book that hadn't long come out, because I am very ancient, hadn't long come out at the time, by a man called Ryder Christensen, who used to do a lot of work in UCD although he was Scandinavian, there were huge connections, of course, between Scandinavian folklore studies and folklore studies in Ireland. And he brought out a book called Parallels. I think it's the exact title is Parallels in Irish and Scandinavian Folktales. And my supervisor just handed me this and said, this might interest you, because I was looking at the Vikings in Ulster at the time. That's another story for another day. And I read this book and I was utterly hooked. I was totally hooked. Now, I don't know if you know this, but the word in Irish, the word that's used in the annals for the Vikings is nalochlani, and the foreigners, nalochlani. So one day I was in Queen's and I was looking for a particular book. I was on home on summer. I'm using the university library there. I was just going along the shelves looking for this book, which, you know, sort of open shelving. And I found a journal. I can't remember the title off the top of my head. I think it was a Journal of Celtic Studies, but it was only ever one issue of this journal. And so it was stored on the shelves with the books and not with the journals in Queen's Library. So quite by chance, I opened this book. This is absolutely true, which was quite by chance on these shelves and not with the journals. And at the page that I opened it up was an article by a man called Alf Sommerfeld, another Scandinavian folklorist, about an article about a story of Finn McCool and the Lachlan. And I then discovered that this word Lachlan had passed into folklore, sometimes, and folklore, Irish folklore sometimes refers to the Danes. You see Danes forts, and sometimes it's interpreted as the Tuatha Dé Danann, but also that this word Lachlan had come into folklore. I was absolutely bitten by this. So when my dissertation was finished and I was being encouraged to do, I applied to do a PhD, and I was being encouraged to take an aspect of my dissertation and follow it through. And I said, right, I'll do the folklore. I really want to study the folklore. This did not go down. These were very different days nowadays, and this did not go down at all. Well, I could have gone to UCD, but you may already have gathered from what I've said that my philosophy, although it hadn't been formulated at that time, I didn't think would fit absolutely, be a complete fit with the philosophy of UCD at the time. And so that was my reason. I didn't want to go there. I wanted to study somewhere where I could follow my own ideas, because I'm very thrawn and inclined to that sort of thing. And so the agreement that was reached between myself and my supervisors, I'd also been offered a course in York to study Anglo-Saxon, do medieval studies. So the compromise that we reached was that I would go to York and do that, and if my head had cooled, that was fine. I could come back then and study, you know, do the PhD in proper Viking stuff. But if my head hadn't cooled and I was still hooked in the folklore, they would agree that I could do the folklore at that time. So guess what? So I was working on oral narrative for my PhD, and to my mother's utter amazement, there was an advertisement in the newspaper one evening for someone to come and collect oral narrative for the Ulster Book Museum. And I applied. I was 22 at the time. And in those days, there was no winter graduation. So I had just done my master's degree, or BPhil it's actually called, but anyway, master's degree in medieval studies in York. But you couldn't graduate. You handed in your dissertation in September. And so you learned about Christmas time whether or not you had passed, and then you graduated in the summer. That's how it was in those days. So I had no parchment for this degree, but I was applying for the job. So I wrote to my supervisor in York and asked if he would mind giving me a letter, because you know, I needed. I think, yes, I'd been offered an interview. I suppose it was at that stage that I asked for this letter from my supervisor to prove that I had actually passed this degree. So I came along to the museum as a very raw. I mean, if you had seen me, I came along. I had a very, very curly hair. I had, in fact, an afro hairstyle in those days. My hair used to be very curly. And I got a turban hat and put all my hair in that and bought a very severe business suit to try. And I also looked younger than I actually was at the time. People used to think I was an undergraduate, although I was a postgrad. So not only was I quite young, but I looked like a living schoolgirl. And So I tucked all my hair up into this hat and got this business suit and went marching along to this interview, hoping that I looked old and sophisticated and like I knew what I was doing. I went into the interview. Now, there were about, I'm not sure, it was quite a large interview panel. I can't remember how many there were, but I don't know if you've ever heard of Aston Evans. Well, he was one of the founding fathers of the Folk Museum, an incredible visionary man. And he was chairing, a professor of geography. He was chairing the interview panel. I mean, this was a person that, as far as I was concerned, had the deity himself been sitting there, you know, I could not have been more overawed. Then there was George Thompson, the director of the museum. And then there was Alan Gailey. Now, at that time, the Folk Museum was still quite in its early days. It hadn't been terribly long established, and these people were pretty much household names. And there they were among this group of others sitting in front of me. And I was just flabbergasted. I was sort of on the edge of my chair, sitting on my hands to try to not, so that no one would see how much my hands were shaking. Oh. I started to do this interview, and I was so nervous. And at some stage, Aston Evans, and I can't actually guess, Aston Evans was wearing glasses. And the interview was in what used to be called the Ferguson room in the museum, the smaller room to the top of the stairs in the manor into the left. So I was sitting with my back to the window. So the sunshine, and the sun was shining through the window, reflecting off Aston Evans' glasses. So I couldn't see his eyes, and I couldn't really see his facial expression, and this was making things worse. And at one point, he asked me if I had any evidence of this master's degree. And I explained the situation. I said, well, I do have a letter from my professor, Professor Purcell, and I rummaged in my hand, I can pull this out, and it went around, and there were all of these people sitting all around the room, and then the top table with it, and different people read it in turn, and it got to Professor Evans. Professor Evans, all three of them were geographers, and here was I, history and literature. And it got to Professor Evans. Professor Evans read it, and he turned and handed it to the next person. He said, in a quite disdainful voice, well, I suppose that's some sort of diploma. I didn't know whether he meant that, you know, it wasn't geography, but it would kind of do, or that the letter was a substitute for a proper parchment. But whatever he meant, it made me really indignant. And I often wondered, I never had the opportunity to ask him, but I often wondered afterwards, did he do it deliberately to see how, you know, to see how I would do it, what was going on there. And the last question, pretty much in the interview, was, well, Miss Smith, how would you feel about having to spend several days up in the mountains talking to old men? And I said, well, something along the lines of, I remember the question, I don't remember my answer as well, but something along the lines of, well, this job would be about collecting folklore and analysing folklore. One has to analyse folklore very carefully, but the folklore still belongs to the people from whom it's, you know, the folklore belongs to these people, and if you're going to study it, you have to recognise your responsibility to those people, and I can't see how you could possibly do that without collecting from them and talking to them and spending time with them. So the next day, I'm at home, and the phone rings. My mother answers the phone, and she calls me to the phone, and there's she tells me who it is. It's Dr. Thompson, and there's an expression on her face that I should have been able to read, but I was so astounded that Dr. Thompson was phoning the house that it didn't occur to me. And as soon as I got on the phone to him, as soon as he said he was speaking, I started to apologise to him for wasting his time because of the dreadful interview that I had done. And I went on and on and on apologising, because, as you may have already gathered, I can talk at some length. And eventually I stopped talking because I needed a breath. And he said, I'm phoning to offer you a job. What the job? Oh. And the noise that went down the telephone must have blown him off his seat at the other end, I suspect. So that was how I came to be working in the museum, and that was my background. So it was by that time both an academic interest and a personal interest. And if you look, the attitude, it's very interesting to look at the late 19th century attitude. If you look at Patrick Kennedy's attitude to folk tales, for instance, it's very, very different from, say, Douglas Hyde's. Because Kennedy is talking, he's emphasising the international nature of folklore and the shared nature of folklore, whereas Irish folklore at that time is very much tied up with the development of the Abbey Theatre. We all know this, the development of the Abbey Theatre, all sorts of things that are to do with Irish culture, and the Irish language is greatly emphasised. Now, that's absolutely, of course, right, and the Irish language should, of course, be preserved, and wonderful, wonderful work was done. But in tandem with that was an idea that certain kinds of stories did not exist in the English language. And I was inclined to accept that. So for a long time, I'm going to jump on something else now, but for a long time, I looked only for really supernatural stories. I tried to collect only certain types of stories because I accepted this myth that certain types of stories, Märchen, Irish Märchen, could not and did not exist in English, and that if they did, they would be debased. And one day I was working, this was long, long before the merger, but I had been asked to go up and do some work, give a lecture actually on folklore at the Ulster American Folk Park. We're talking about the 1970s now. And it was a long journey. So I decided to go up in the afternoon and see if I could do a bit of well, I wanted to talk actually to the man who was employed in as the blacksmith in Omagh at that time. And he then told me about a friend of his called Frank McKenna, a local man, but one who'd got, Frank McKenna.
only from listening to the, yeah.
Well, this is how I met Frank McKenna. Frank, the blacksmith in the folk park, arranged for me to meet Frank the next time he came home, because his brothers lived here, and he came home regularly. So I went up. My first interview with Frank, I mean, if you listen, you'll hear this. My first interview with Frank, I was looking for the sorts of stories that I would normally look for. And if you listen to Frank, that you maybe hear there's tension. Because Frank keeps trying to tell me something else, and I keep asking him stories. And then there is one point where he launches into, I'm pretty sure it's the Steed of Bells, and he gets impatient with me. And he launches into Once Upon a Time There Was a King in Ireland, or however begins the story. And I sit and I listen to this man telling a story that isn't supposed to exist in the English language. At least in Ireland. I'm utterly floored by this. And of course, Frank has this remarkable repertoire of American and other stories to tell about, but it wasn't until that experience in fieldwork that I learned how wrong my assumptions were. I mean, another assumption at that time, of course, was that women weren't women weren't storytellers, that there were a great many assumptions. If you look at Bridget Murphy, if you've come across her stories, an amazing storyteller. But I did work, and another of my prejudices is that I worked almost entirely with men. And actually, it was much more difficult to get women to tell stories, because women stayed in the background. Most of the work that I did with the most intensive work that I did with women was around the subject of childbirth. And I could only do that when I became a mother myself, because again, nobody certainly in those days was going to discuss the rigors of childbirth with someone who hadn't gone through it. And so again, I had to become part of the in-crowd and the in-group before I could actually do that. But partly because I looked for male storytellers, I also looked, and I'll tell you a story about this in a minute, I also looked for storytellers over a certain age, because the assumption was that traditions were dying, so only old people would have them. Now, these things are not entirely untrue, but they are not the complete truth. So that, for instance, when I went to Rathlin Island, there's a story about Rathlin Island as well, which I'll tell you in a moment. But the first serious fieldwork that I did on Rathlin Island, I did my usual thing when I wanted to collect, which was I went into a local shop, put my tape recorder on which was a huge walloping thing, put it on the counter and waited for someone to ask me why I was carrying this great machine around.
Great tactic.
And I would say, I'm looking at my local traditions or something like that, and inevitably the shopkeeper would direct me to Mr. or Mrs. And there was an occasion, Lady in Tyrone, a wonderful storyteller in Tyrone, that I was directed to. But generally speaking, I was directed to men. was almost always men that I was directed to. So I went into the shop on Rathlin, and the shopkeeper was, I hope she won't mind me telling this story, she might be very cross with her, but with me, but no name should be mentioned, was a woman of about my own age with a fairly strong Glaswegian accent.
Mm-hmm.
And I put my tape recorder on the counter to no avail, to absolutely no avail. And eventually I had to say, oh, I'm looking to collect information about, the traditions and history of the island. And she gave me a fairly short response and said, there's books written about that. And I said, yes, but I'm not sure the books tell the whole story, or something to that effect. And then she said, you can come tonight and talk to my husband. I thought, well, unless your husband is at least a generation older than you, that's not going to work. But I thought, well, maybe if I go and talk to your husband, perhaps I'll get to meet his father, and maybe I'll be able to get in that way. And then she put the cap on it by saying, he'll be scuba diving tonight. He'll be home at about 9 o'clock. Come then. And I thought, I do not want to go and talk to this man who's going to be far too young who goes scuba diving. This just isn't going to work. So I had to cut on assumptions. So I went along to the house and I took one tape. Take a look and you will see this in the archive. I took one tape with me thinking, well, I'll go for politeness sake. Mm-hmm. I was there for hours. And that was long after the tape had run out. I was there many, many times because that's how I met Tommy Cecil. So again, Tommy subverted all the expectations. He was a young man, very active, very fit, going scuba diving, and he was he himself was he had made himself a deliberate repository of the traditions of the island. He effectively had collected the island's traditions himself. Not necessarily, he had notebooks, he had things written down, as had Frank kept notebooks too, but he had very, very deliberately set himself to ensuring that the island's traditions weren't lost. And I think he was a remarkable man, and I think he's owed huge debts of gratitude, not least for that. So I suppose those are sort of some of the assumptions and some of the things that I learned in that part of my career about the fact that a lot of these things weren't actually true. And Jeremiah Curtin also, I don't know how this would be tested now. Clifford Harkness once said to me, do you think, about 10 years ago, I suppose it was now, do you think if you were to go out and collect now, it would be the same? And I said, well, no, it wouldn't, because first of all, I think I'm probably far too old and creaky now to go out collecting stories. You have to stay up till 2 or 3 in the morning, working with people late at night, and I wasn't necessarily at my best anymore at that time in the morning. But also I said, I'm not quite sure what the repository of folklore would be. Have these stories all died out? But if you look, Jeremiah Curtin, when he produced one of his collections, in his foreword, in his preface to it, he says how he was, I think it was in Kerry, and he went up to, this is toward the end of the 19th century, he went to the landlord of the local hostelry one evening and said that he was interested in collecting lore. And the response was, oh, you should have been here 10 years ago, 10 years ago. There's so many people who could have told you stories and all of that sort of stuff, but they're all gone now, you're too late. So that idea that it's too late, that it's something that belongs to a previous generation, but there's none of it left now, is itself a piece of folklore. Well, at least it was what I was collecting.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Wow, there are so many things I want to ask you about within that conversation that's just happened, but this idea that it's too late, like, what, I guess the question is, how much truth is in that? Or if we always think it's too late, are we ever going to collect the stories and try and find the lore? And then with that, is there a specific, like you'd mentioned, there was a specific kind of lore that you were interested in collecting until you kind of changed assumptions or expectations about what that lore might be. Like, those are massive, massive things in collecting and understanding lore as I understand it, because I don't know about you, but there seems to be a definite resurgence or want to connect to the past for the first time, it maybe in a couple of generations, or it's almost become, I wouldn't say trendy, but there's an interest there, you know.
Well, I think these things are cyclical, and I think the interest had fallen away. I'm glad I've survived long enough to see it being revitalized. So that I think that's very interesting. And I mean, when the Folk Museum was founded, it was founded by visionary people who realised that whatever might divide us in this country, there was more that united us than divided us, that we shared more than caused us to be separated. And I mean, if you think of, I'm not a political historian of any sort, and I'm certainly not a 20th century historian, but if you look at what was happening politically at that time, if you look at, I mean, I mentioned Robin Kinnahan, who was chairman of the board. I mean, there's a certain political approach there. You know, there were political decisions that were being taken, that this investment of this rather enormous amount of money in this museum had some kind of meaning for people, that it had some kind of resonance, which was ultimately, which began with culture, but ultimately the other end of that spectrum was politics. And you know, the museum was making very deliberate statements. It was very highly valued, and then through time it kind of fell away until, in my view, particularly with the Folk Museum, it became almost like a sort of a chocolate box tourist attraction. There's nothing wrong with people wanting to go around and look at the old cottages. And, you know, that had changed over generations. I mean, when I went to work in the Folk Museum,
around what year was that? Sorry, Linda, I don't know.
I'm going to give my age away now. 1975. You must delete all references.
I can definitely ask you to blip.
Because obviously I'm only 21, even though I told you I was 22 when I started.
Yeah. Age, time is cyclical, as you say. So I mean, what is age at this point in interesting time? But sorry, please continue.
Well, yes, we can always see there are lots of philosophical strands that we could pick up on from this. Oh yes, well, I was going to digress there to say that I actually did field work in houses that had that were effectively, not everyone had stopped living in houses that had no running water, you know. But I ate bread that was cooked in a pot oven over a fire, because that was how the people who lived in this particular house were living. You know, and you never tasted anything like bread made in a pot oven. It's just on an open fire. It's just amazing. So that way of life hadn't been totally abandoned at that time, and most certainly people come in maybe with their parents, or certainly with their grandparents. They would say, "Oh, look, there's a griddle. There's a such and a thing." You know, we had that in the house. But by the time I left, that generational connection had gone. You know, so it wasn't like the grandma taking the grandchildren and sort of making a connection through it. And the museum became what my view of it was, that it became the level of understanding of what the museum was for and what its valency could be in society, what a resource it offered in terms of looking at culture, but maybe coming to an understanding of political issues, was just not understood. I mean, this is really why I left. It was just not understood, that instead of realizing its deeper capacity to allow people to explore various aspects of their identity, it had just become a sort of picture postcard place. And as I said, lots of people are going to go to the museum, I hope, still, and go around and just enjoy it and just, you know, just have a lovely day out. And that's perfectly fine. I'm not in any way criticizing that, that's wonderful. But there is far, far more to it. There are far deeper potentialities than that, which I think relates to exactly what you're saying when you say, you know, there's now this hunger for this kind of understanding, and that, you know, that wheel has turned again.
Yeah, wow. It's incredible that you said that, because I think definitely with this project, and hopefully with the people who are on this project, you know, the idea is that we are connecting to ourselves and our own identities, through understanding our place, and the stories that are of that place and the people around us. And that is really exciting to me. You know, and I hope it's exciting to them or to you who will be
Well, it's
watching
very
this
exciting
video.
to me. I'm sure it's exciting to any reasonable person. Not that I'm biased in any way.
Yeah, and it's that thing. Yeah, I completely, you know, I guess what I'm interested in is, you know, in your fieldwork and in your collecting, you know, you've already mentioned about assumptions and overcoming those assumptions, or being surprised by those assumptions in the field. And, you know, did you find that there are more that connects us than divides us when you're talking about folklore in the field? And what kind of stories, you know, were the stories largely the same between area, or is that a specific enough question? Or, I mean, I'm just, yeah, following the flow.
I would say, I think the way I'm trying to answer this in a way that doesn't sound as if I'm being negative critical of anything. But I would say that, I mean, for instance, if you listen to the tapes that I made around Kilrats, the sort of information that there is on those, it's mostly jokes, are very short pieces. There are very, very few expanded traditions. There are one or two Protestant storytellers, but the vast majority of people who are telling traditional law, or, you know, opening up about traditional law, are Catholic. The vast majority. And so I think that I think that possibly quite a lot had been lost. I mean, for instance, so to give an example, toward the mid to the late 19th century, Presbyterians began suppressing wakes. Well, they couldn't have suppressed them if they hadn't had them. And
That's brilliant.
so, you know, as the example I've given of my grandmother and her sister, and the way that her sister valued that story of the fairy woman. You know, I wonder how much have been edited out because of assumptions of value, feelings of, I suppose it would be called culture. In a way, it's cultural appropriation, I suppose. That because my family was not Catholic, was not nationalist, although my great-grandfather was the only Protestant in Dunmurray village who was in favour of home rule.
Wow.
And I've checked this, he didn't sign the covenant, but his wife marched down with all her daughters who were old enough and all her best friends, because you can see all their names, and signed the the Declaration of Women. Can you imagine what the political arguments were? Can you imagine what dinner time was like in that time? But the cultural background from which I came was not one where it was expected that I would speak Irish, which I did because I was lucky to get a really great Irish teacher just before I did my undercert. You know, that I would be interested in folklore. Those weren't things in the 1970s that a young Protestant woman was supposed to be interested in Northern Ireland. And I think that there are reasons for that, because folk stories will only survive if they're relevant.
That's interesting.
And so while, for instance, fairy lore was fading out, and it wasn't the particular, you know, it was much more difficult to reassure people that it was okay to tell fairy stories. I mean, stories of the you know, about the wee folk, than it was to get them to tell ghost stories. Because people still had the the inclination toward the supernatural in terms of ghost stories. They're quite open about telling ghost stories. But telling fairy stories was sort of, I mean, I can remember one particular occasion where there were about 4 people around, very, very seldom reported groups, but there were about 4 or 5 people sitting around a table. And it wasn't until one person left the room that I was, until that point, um, anytime I tried to raise the subject of fairy lore, everyone veered off in another direction. One person left, and suddenly all the fairy lore came pouring out. So that person's presence, all that I could conclude was that person's presence was having an editorial effect on what people would talk about. They wouldn't talk about that in front of that person because that person would have been dismissive of it. But once he had gone, all the others were quite happy to talk and actually knew rather a lot. So something that I would say also is that there is a value judgment, or there certainly was in the past, that stories must be oral. Now, I have very strong views about the fact that a story told is not the same as that story transcribed. A story told exists in the telling, and to a degree is a sort of contract between the storyteller and the listeners. Because if you're, certainly in my experience, if you're telling stories, you watch how people are reacting all the time, and you can feel how they are reacting to you, and therefore you slightly modify the story depending on your audience reaction. I don't mean that you radically alter the plot, but you may alter intonation, you may add certain details. So your telling may not be identical because it is from one audience to another. Because to a degree, when you're telling a story, you're relying on audience response. But I do not agree with the idea that storytelling, that there is no relationship between written stories and oral stories. I mean, for instance, the purest view would be that stories must be transmitted only from speaker to speaker, only from narrator to narrator, and there is no intervention of the written word. And I think that's nonsense. I think as soon as people were literate, they were reading. And I mean, there are examples of this. There's one example that I'm sure I've seen in UCD. I'm sure it's in the archive in UCD. And it's variants of the story of Hudden and Dudden. And it's about big cloths and little cloths. So it's, obviously someone has heard, and it's not a great version, but obviously someone has heard this story orally, possibly heard it read as a child, and then is relaying it as an example. So as soon as people are literate, as soon as they have access to written material, the written material is going to influence the oral. So, for instance, would I object to, has I had any right, but would I have a philosophical objection to, even if storytelling had completely died out and people started to be interested in it again and wanted to tell stories, would I consider it valid that they read a transcript from the Folk Museum or that they read something from a 19th century published source and then started telling that? Of course, that's perfectly valid. Of course, that's perfectly valid, because what is happening there is that, people either are storytellers or they aren't. And if they are, they're going to tell stories. And the sort of stories that they tell depend on what they feel is relevant to express and what people are going to react to in a positive way.
Oh, that's really interesting. It's because that connects the dots for the stages of this story while taking the people out of it. It's like the many stages that a story goes through to be passed on or to be listened to. And this idea of relevance as well is something that I'd never thought about before. I wonder actually if I can take you back a couple of sentences and ask, if this isn't too crass a question, to ask about the difference between folklore, ghost stories and myths. And I mean, that's maybe quite a crass and big question to ask. And I mean, for me, I'm especially interested in the difference between folklore and ghost story. Because when I was growing up, I mean, ghost stories and folklore went hand in hand, and it's only as an adult and reflecting and being able to point to place and say, that's where my grandmother saw 12 ghosts standing one night. Oh, that's where the fairies appeared to my uncle this night, and they were all playing
Oh, that's good. The fairies are still around then.
Well, I think they're still around now. My uncle said to my granddad, I heard this music at the bottom of the lane. It sounded like fairies was making it. What, like, did you hear anything? And my granddad turned around to him and goes, I hear that all the time, Simon, you know. And my uncle was astounded, and he turned around and went, I've lived here for far too long. And that's my uncle is in his 40s. So it's interesting when we talk about relevance and stories that still exist or experiences. I mean, but yeah, to kind of focus the question, folklore, ghost, and myth, or what's the
you tell me the distinction that you're making, first of all, between folklore and ghost story. So
oh. This is interesting. I forgot that you are by nature an interviewer and collector of knowledge. Yeah, I mean, for me, a ghost story is part of folklore. I think it comes of it, in the sense of, if we have folklore as a description of stories that are passed from one generation to the next, whatever way that might be, orally or written, then within that ghost stories live, and the supernatural is within that. But is that supernatural of ghost story and stories around fairies the same supernatural, or is it different? And I am a complete novice in this area. I mean, I'm doing this for, you know, as an exploration for myself to understand the differences and these nuances that exist in worlds that I'm only beginning to understand.
well, I mean, you're asking kind of the meaning of life and everything in a sense, at least as far as narrative is concerned. So it's not, you're quite right, it's a big question. But how do we distinguish between a legend and a märchen and a myth? Well, for a start, different people actually have slightly differing definitions. You know, the definition, people assume that they're using these words in the same ways, and some people have defined them very, very closely. But the thing about stuff, if you look at the Smith-Thomson Index, do you know what the Smith-Thomson Index is?
No, I have.
Oh, you have an excitement awaiting you. Folk narrative has been classified so that you will find the types of the folk tale. This was originally done by a man called Arne Thompson, who's Scandinavian, and then an American called Smith-Thomson updated it, and it has since been updated again by a German. But you'll find so these are from the types of the folk tale. Märchen are defined there. So the Steed of Bells, for example. Smith-Thomson went one step further, and he produced a 5-volume index of the motifs of folk narrative. And we can get in at the later stage to what exactly constitutes a motif. And we will discuss that for 4 or 5 days, and we will really come to no conclusion. And we'll go away again. But what Smith-Thomson does is he gives index numbers. So all different types. If you hear a ghost story, you should be able to index it according to this international index. And FE is the letter for ghosts, and you will find thousands and thousands of references for ghost stories. F is the letter for fairies. And somewhere in the copy in the museum library, assuming it's still there, you will see in my handwriting from when because I use these to classify stories, these were the tools I used for classification, you will see that I have added a number in frustration one day to the motif index, which is F, whatever number I gave it. Fairies resist pigeonholing. Unless someone has erased it, it should still be there.
Oh, well, I very much look forward to getting on site whenever quarantine is over, to having a nosy. And if I get to that particular point, I'll take a photo and send it to you. Yeah, it's such an interesting one. It's a big question, and I guess as well for the people who are going to be watching this video, you know, for me, it's important to make sure that this is accessible, that folk tales or folklore or ghost stories or myths are accessible. There's not this barrier that you have to be a certain kind of person or have a certain kind of understanding to be able to tell a story or share a story or listen to a story. And I wonder if you'd any thoughts on that in terms of, you know, writing down stories that maybe people have heard from when they were children, or that they've heard from their grandparents? Or have you any tips or hints on that kind of
Effectively,
way?
how to go about collecting, even if the collecting is from memory, rather, you know, from the recesses of one's own memory, rather than from actually going out and talking to a grandparent. I would say if you have, if someone told you a story, I mean, you've given brilliant examples. For instance, of, was it your grandmother seeing the ghosts, or your grandfather hearing the fairy, your uncle hearing the fairy music? That if people have any, you know, if people are interested in this, that might possibly, I mean, one way of approaching it, and you will have thought about this a great deal more than I can suggest to you, might be just to dredge that from memory and to put words on it, and either put it down on a page or retell it and record it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly the answer I wanted to hear.
Oh, good.
No, what I want to hear is anything to do with this conversation. But I think it's perhaps in the same way that, as you were saying from the beginning, there was a certain kind of person in the 70s that this culture belonged to, or that these folk tales belonged to, and that it wasn't as accessible to everyone. And I want to make sure that that's just not the case with this, and for me, folklore and folk tales aren't exclusive. They're of the people and for the people, and that's why it's an absolute delight to get to listen to you. I mean, I know it's the first time we're having a conversation as well, so and I hope it'll be the first of very many.
So
But
do I.
yeah, thank you so much. I mean,
oh, it's an absolute pleasure. But yes, folk tales belong to the people, and they are what the people tell. You know, folk are people. Everybody is a folk. It doesn't matter if you're a titled person or, you know, everybody is a person. So what's folklore? Folklore is what people talk about.
Yeah.
Does folklore extend beyond narrative? Yes, it does, because what I would find in collecting was that you had to allow a conversation to have its own rhythm, so that people might be telling me stories, and then they might want to talk about something else for a while, so they would talk about, I don't know, price of beer, whatever it was that they were talking about. But I think that is the natural rhythm. That is the way that stories would have been told in the past. When people were sitting around the fireside at night and there were no laptops or TVs or whatever, I suspect that is actually how it was. That stories were conversational, so that they would come in and out. Just take the example that you've given. Let's imagine some mythical group of people sitting around a fireside at some point in the past, and someone says, "Oh, did you hear the music tonight?" "Oh, yes, sure, I hear it all the time, absolutely." And then someone else turns around and says, "Oh, that reminds me, do you remember the time so-and-so's child was taken?" And, a story comes out of that. I mean, that's a fairly crude example. But what I mean by that is that I do not think, and this is why I have actually committed many heresies in my time. And one of them is to say that I don't believe in the Shanachie. And what I mean when I say that I don't believe in the Shanachie is that I don't actually I believe that people were respected for their gifts as storytellers. But I don't believe that this was a sort of person who was absolutely set apart. I'm quite sure that gifted storytellers were known, but I think and acknowledged and, as I say, respected. But I think that was in the same way that, say, the blacksmith would be known and respected for his skills, or someone who baked exceptional bread would be known for hers, or someone who was particularly good at it. It was a natural part, in my opinion, and from what I have observed, it was a natural part of everyday experience. Rather than something set apart. So when I say I don't believe the Shanachie, I don't believe that there were these people who were sort of put on cultural pedestals. I believe that they were there, integrated in. I mean, in the way that, or if to look at the opposite of what I've said, if I believe in the Shanachie, I believe, for instance, that Frank McKenna was a Shanachie. I believe that Tommy Cecil was a Shanachie, a man who went out scuba diving and went about his life and was a fisherman and did what he did. father of children, member of the community, and he was also a storyteller. See what I'm getting at?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that also, I mean, it makes this even more relevant. It makes this conversation even more relevant to the connecting and collection of folk tales, because it's an everyday experience. Sorry, there's something happening outside my window here which caused distraction. But yeah, it's again, when it comes back to that question of relevance and storytelling or folklore continuing to exist because it's relevant, you know, it's part of the community, it's part of the experience. And I mean, if I didn't have to have a focus in mind for this conversation, I would ask, do you think the Shanachie and Druids were linked, for example? But perhaps that's unless, yeah. Or
I don't know, because I don't know what a Druid was. I have a fair idea what a Druid is, to be honest. I'd thought it.
Yeah.
I mean, now, are you getting at, do I believe that stories were passed down since time immemorial, since prehistoric times? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that that's probably correct, because look at the comparisons between the folklore, certainly things that I collected, to just use myself as an example, because I can't really use anyone else, and Homer. I mean, I have a friend, Maureen Alden, who is a specialist in Homeric studies, and she's written extensively about this. Take a look at her books on Homer, and I mean, we talk fairly constantly about about parallels between Irish folklore and Homer. I mean, maybe we'll be going along in the car somewhere and I will launch into a story and she will say, oh, that's such a thing from Homer, you know. So there'll be parallels that, even though I like to think that I would know Homer reasonably well, there'll be parallels she will pick up on because of her knowledge base that I haven't even seen, you know. So I can be talking to her and she's like, oh, look, there's another one, sort of thing. So I think that that's a fair degree of proof that, yes, these have been around for a very long time. Do I think that that can be translated into understanding what people believed in the Bronze Age? No. No, I don't. Except that, you know, they told stories and that they were human and that they were probably not that different from us in many respects. But do I think that from that we can extrapolate what their belief system was, their entire belief system, and figure out you know, how they interacted with the spiritual world? Absolutely not. No, I don't think that at all, because we just don't know. Unless we can go and talk to them and ask them, we can't. How can we possibly tell that? So do I think it gives us an insight into an ancient world? Yes. Do I think it shows that humans are connected through space and time? I mean, place and time? Yes, of course. But do I think that we can deduce that now, of course, there are people who study New Age stuff. I don't go into that very much, but I mean, there's a whole brand of New Age studies in folklore, and I'm quite sure that they would think very differently from me. But you really have to read what they're saying and talk to them to find out. That they would disagree. But do I think that we can? I mean, I like visiting stone circles. It's a great pleasure of mine. And it makes me extremely grumpy to discover that it has also become a great pleasure of other people, because when I go to the stone circle, I expect to be there on my own and to have it to myself and not to share it with anybody, because I'm very selfish about it. And more and more, of course, people are going to these. And there have been a couple of occasions when I have seen what I can only describe as shamanistic rituals being carried out at stone circles. Now, people, as far as my opinion on that is, if people want to go to stone circles and carry out shamanistic ceremonies, apart from the fact that I am irritated if anybody is in the stone circle when I am there at all, most particularly people climbing up on them. But anyhow, that's a hobby horse I'll not get into. Am I concerned that they're conducting a shamanistic ritual? No, of course not. If they want to conduct a shamanistic ritual at stone circle, they're perfectly within their rights to do that. Do I think that's got anything to do with what happened in 2000 BC? No. No, that's what that person is doing now, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's interesting how we, you know, I think it comes back into that wanting to connect with the past in a certain way, and how do we do that? And it's a very interesting series of conversations, and aside from the conversation that we're having now, I'm sure I could tell you a few stories of my own experiences of stone circles and different practices, but that's another story for another day.
We're going to have a lot of cups of tea.
Well, yeah, maybe if we draw this section of the conversation to a close, in terms of Jude can take this for his recording, and maybe we can have another wee bit of a chat, because I really enjoy chatting to you. But if you had one piece of, this is like a very naff question, so do forgive
me. Like the Desert Island Discs, so it's my favourite bit.
Desert Island Discs in the age of quarantine. No, if you had one kind of, what was your biggest piece of learning in terms of collecting or listening in the way that you have done over the years and through fieldwork? If you could share a big piece of learning with someone, what would it be? What would it?
To listen. To listen, and to listen carefully, and to realise that no matter how carefully you think you're listening, or how experienced you think you are by collecting, that the people who are doing the speaking are the ones who know the stuff, and you've got to listen to them, and you've got to be sure that you listen to them as carefully and responsibly as you can, because I think of Frank McKenna eventually having to burst more or less into frustration before he could tell me the state of bells. So don't assume, just listen and be open and be ready to follow up with questions. And I can see that you are very good at this. Let the person talk, don't interpose with your questions until they finish telling you whatever it is that they're telling you. Because that was something when I was doing interviews, for instance, more about oral history than narrative, although sometimes it happened with narrative too. But if there was someone else with me, and if there was an obvious question, they might zip in and ask the obvious question. I'd be, no, I don't ask that. Of course I want to ask that, but not yet, because we have to first of all find out. I'm trying to. We found out A and B, and now we're on C, and we're on C3, and I want to get to C7 before I move on to D, and you've moved on to Z. Do you see what I'm saying? So if you're doing an interview, if you're interviewing, if you're deliberately collecting, it's not the same as sitting around just listening to stories. You've got to keep in your head. And I never did structured interviews. I did what might be called loosely semi-structured interviews, by which I would have some kind of idea of what it was that I wanted to find out with people, and some kind of idea about how I was going to find it out. But my interviews were always structured by the person who I was interviewing. My structure was in response to them. It wasn't imposing my structure on what's happening. Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense, and it really makes me, well, first of all, I feel excited. And secondly, if I think of that as an inward respect, if I as a person am not able to collect from other people, especially in the time that we're living in now, it's having that capacity to listen to myself, to collect from my memory, and that puts a whole other shift on the collecting and remembering. It's really taken the time to listen to that part of myself. Does that make sense? Yeah,
it definitely does.
Which I hope makes sense to the people who are watching this video. But yeah, thank you so much.